November the 16th, 1957, a hardware store in Plainfield, Wisconsin. 50-year-old Bernice Worden is working alone when a customer walks in at 9:30 a.m. Someone she knows, someone the whole town considers harmless. By evening, Bernice is dead, murdered, and when police search the killer's farmhouse, they discover something that defies comprehension. Human skulls used as bowls, lampshades made from human faces, furniture upholstered with human skin. The killer's name was Ed Gein. The press would call him the Butcher of Plainfield. And what investigators found in his house would inspire decades of horror films and change how America understood evil itself. But this isn't a story about a movie monster. This is the story of Ed Gein and how a quiet farm boy became something far more terrifying than fiction. This is Murder and Coffee. I'm your host, Matt Cochran. November the 16th, 1957, Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small farming community where everyone knows everyone and doors are rarely locked. It's a Saturday morning, and 58-year-old Bernice Worden is opening her hardware store, just like she has every weekday for the past 15 years. Bernice was what you would call the backbone of the community, a no-nonsense businesswoman who earned the respect of every farmer in the county. Her husband had left her the store when he died, and she had proven more than capable of running it on her own. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the bell above her door chimed. The customer who walked in was someone she knew well, Ed Gein, a quiet 51-year-old bachelor farmer who lived alone about 2 miles outside of town. To everyone in Plainfield, Ed seemed harmless, eccentric, a little odd, but polite and helpful when called upon. Ed asked for antifreeze, a half-gallon container. It was a routine transaction. Bernice walked to the automotive section, pulled a red container from the shelf, and returned to the counter. She opened her sales ledger and wrote 9:30 a.m. antifreeze, $1.85. But Ed Gein didn't simply pay for his antifreeze and leave. Instead, he committed an act of violence so brutal and calculated that it would shock even hardened law enforcement officers. Using a .22 caliber rifle he had taken from the store's own inventory, Ed shot Bernice Worden in the back of the head. The kill wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. Ed had been thinking about this moment for days, possibly weeks. After shooting her, Ed loaded Bernice's body into his pickup truck along with a brass cash register. He made a hasty attempt to clean up the blood, but the evidence was impossible to completely erase. For the residents of Plainfield, going about their Saturday morning routines, life continued normally. No one noticed that Worden's hardware had closed earlier than usual. No one saw Ed's battered pickup truck speeding down country roads toward his isolated farm. No one could have imagined that their quiet, eccentric neighbor had just committed murder. By 5:30 that evening, when Bernice failed to come home for dinner, her son Frank, who happened to be a deputy sheriff, went to check on her. What he found at the hardware store sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter weather. The front door was unlocked, but all the lights were off. Behind the counter, dark stains marked the wooden floor in an irregular pattern. The cash register was missing. There was blood, lots of blood. The sheriff arrived within minutes. The blood stains told a story. Someone had been shot behind the counter, probably near where the cash register normally sat. A trail of droplets led from behind the counter through the store and out the back door where tire tracks were visible in the snow. The last entry in Bernice's cell's ledger was clear. 9:30 a.m., antifreeze, $1.85. No customer name recorded, but Frank Worden knew his mother was meticulous about her record keeping. The sheriff knew they needed to pay Ed Gein a visit. The drive to the Gein farm took them down increasingly isolated country roads. The farmhouse was exactly what you would expect from someone considered the local eccentric. Paint peeling from the wooden siding, boarded up windows, a front porch sagging under the weight of accumulated junk. Ed appeared from one of the buildings as soon as their car doors slammed shut. In the beam of the sheriff's flashlight, he looked exactly as always, thin, slightly stooped, wearing clothes that had seen better days, but something was different. Instead of his usual awkward friendliness, he seemed nervous, almost agitated. The sheriff asked him about Bernice Worden's disappearance. Ed provided an alibi. He claimed he had been visiting his neighbor, Henry Hill, most of the day. But the sheriff noticed something odd. Ed kept glancing toward a small outbuilding, positioning himself between the officers and that particular structure, as if he was trying to direct their attention away from it. When the sheriff asked if they could look around the property, Ed hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. He insisted they wouldn't find anything interesting, but the way he emphasized certain words struck both officers as odd. The sheriff decided to start with the building Ed seemed most anxious about, a small structure that locals knew as a summer kitchen. As they approached, a smell became apparent, something sweet and metallic that made both officers' stomachs turn. It was a smell they both recognized, the unmistakable odor of blood and death. The sheriff pushed open the door and shined his flashlight inside. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hanging from the rafters by ropes tied around the ankles was the decapitated, gutted corpse of Bernice Worden. She had been dressed like a deer, cleaned and prepared with a methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ed Gein was immediately arrested for murder, but as investigators would soon discover, what they found was only the beginning. The true horror lay waiting inside the main farmhouse. By dawn the next morning, a team of law enforcement officers, medical personnel, and crime scene specialists had arrived at the property. What they found inside Ed's house would challenge every assumption they had ever made about human nature. The smell hit them first, a mixture of decay, unwashed clothing, and something else that investigators described as the distinctive odor of death itself. Every room was cluttered with accumulated debris, newspapers, magazines, broken furniture. But mixed in with the ordinary junk were objects that defied comprehension. On a kitchen table sat a human skull that had been converted into a soup bowl, the top sawed off with surgical precision. Nearby were 4 chairs, their seats replaced with strips of human skin that had been carefully tanned and stretched over the wooden frames. In the living room, they found a lampshade made from a human face. The skin had been preserved with the facial features intact, lips, nose, even eyelashes still clearly visible. The electric cord ran through the mouth. But perhaps the most disturbing was what they found hanging on bedroom walls like hunting trophies. 10 human skulls. Some still had hair attached. Others had been completely cleaned. Several showed evidence of modification. Holes drilled for hanging, or tops sawed off to create bowls. In a paper bag on a dresser wrapped in brown paper like groceries from the local market were the preserved heads of two women. The basement revealed the true scope of Ed's activities. It was nothing less than a fully equipped workshop for processing human remains, complete with specialized tools, preservation chemicals, and work surfaces that showed evidence of extensive use. The most disturbing discovery was what Ed would later describe as his masterpiece, a complete vest made from the torso of a female victim, including breast and female genitalia. The garment had been carefully crafted with string ties designed to be worn like clothing. They found belts made from human skin, complete with nipples still attached, a collection of human noses stored in a shoebox, various organs preserved for unknown purposes. Based on the number of skulls and the variety of preserved body parts, it was clear that Ed had been obtaining human material from multiple sources over many years. To understand how Ed Gein became the monster they arrested that November night, we need to go back to the beginning to understand the woman who created him, Augusta Gein. Augusta Gein was a fanatically religious woman with rigid moral views and an iron will. From the moment Ed was born on August the 27th, 1906, she controlled every aspect of his existence. The Gein family farm sat on 160 acres of isolated land outside of Plainfield. Augusta preferred it that way. The farther her family was from outside influences, the better she could protect them from what she saw as corruption. Every night Augusta would tell her son that the world was full of evil, full of bad people who wanted to hurt good children like him. She insisted that he must always stay close to Mother, because she was the only one who truly loved him. Ed's father, George, was a weak alcoholic who provided no counterbalance to Augusta's extreme control. When he died in 1940, Ed and his older brother Henry were left completely under their mother's psychological domination. Henry, who was several years younger, had begun to question their mother's teachings. He would suggest that perhaps they should have more contact with neighbors, that her constant criticism and control were unhealthy. Henry would tell their father during a rare private conversation that Augusta was destroying Ed, that Eddie was 20 years old and couldn't make a decision about what to have for breakfast without asking her permission. But Ed had learned that agreeing with his mother, accepting her judgments without question, was the path to peace. Any attempt at independence was met with lectures about dangers awaiting disobedient children. Augusta repeatedly told her sons that all women were whores except for her. She claimed they were vessels of sin and corruption that must never be trusted. Henry's challenges to Augusta's authority created impossible psychological pressure for Ed. When forced to choose between his brother's suggestions for independence and his mother's demands for continued dependence, Ed invariably chose his mother's side. Then, on May 16th, 1944, Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a grass fire on the farm. The official cause was listed as smoke inhalation, but there were unexplained bruises on his head. Ed was the one who found the body. With Henry gone, there was no longer any challenge to Augusta's absolute authority. Ed's psychological development, already arrested, became even more extreme. On December the 29th, 1945, Augusta Gein died of a massive stroke. For Ed, his mother's death represented the end of everything that had given his life meaning. Augusta hadn't just been his parent. She had been his entire world. She said, "Don't let them take me away from you, Eddie." She whispered this as she lay dying, promise your mother you won't let them put me in the ground where I'll be cold and alone." "I promise, Mother," Ed replied desperately, "and I'll never let them separate us." Those were Augusta's last words. She had spent nearly 39 years molding Ed into the perfect dependent. Even in death, she was extracting promises that would ensure her continued influence over his life. After Augusta's death, Ed sealed off most of the farmhouse, living only in a small section. His mother's room remained exactly as she had left it. He would spend hours in there, talking to her as if she were still alive. But talking to his dead mother wasn't enough. Ed needed something more tangible, something that would allow him to maintain a physical connection with death itself. It was sometime in late March 1946 that Ed made his first nocturnal visit to Plainfield Cemetery. He would later claim he didn't remember making the conscious decision. He simply found himself walking among the graves in the middle of the night. The first grave he violated belonged to Eleanor Adams, a middle-aged woman who had died of cancer and bore a passing resemblance to Augusta. Ed's first exhumation was crude and desperate, but what he found fascinated rather than revolted him. Using farm tools and techniques adapted from butchering animals, Ed removed portions of Eleanor's body and took them back to the farmhouse. His goal, he claimed, was to understand death better, to find ways to preserve things, to keep his mother with him somehow. Over the following months, Ed violated at least 6 more graves in Plainfield Cemetery, always choosing women who resembled his mother, always working under cover of darkness. Each one taught him more about preservation. In the farmhouse basement, he began creating what could only be described as a workshop for processing human remains. He made bowls from skulls, lampshades from facial skin, chairs, seats from strips of human hide. But even fresh corpses from the cemetery weren't enough. The bodies were often too decomposed to work with efficiently. Ed began to realize that his experiments would be more successful if he had access to truly fresh material, bodies that had never been buried at all. This realization led to his first murder. On December the 8th, 1954, Mary Hogan was working alone at her tavern when Ed walked in. Mary was a tough, independent woman who bore a striking physical resemblance to Augusta Gein. Ed had been studying her for months, comparing her appearance to his mental image of his mother. In his increasingly distorted perception, Mary had begun to represent a potential replacement for Augusta. He said, "I thought she was Mother," he would tell investigators. "She looked like Mother. She talked like Mother. I thought God had sent her back to me." Using a .32 caliber revolver, Ed shot Mary once in the head at close range. With the tavern nearly empty and a snowstorm providing cover, he was able to load her body into his truck and drive back to the farmhouse without being detected. Mary's disappearance was attributed to any number of possibilities: robbery, domestic violence, simple abandonment. No one suspected the quiet bachelor farmer who occasionally stopped by for a beer. Mary's murder provided Ed with the fresh human material he needed for nearly 3 years. He managed to satisfy his psychological needs through a combination of grave robbing and the preservation work conducted in his basement. But by late 1957, his supply was running low again. He needed to kill again, and he had already selected his next victim, Bernice Worden. Ed's confession revealed a mindset that had completely normalized acts most people would find unthinkable. He spoke about his activities with a casual tone that another person might use to discuss gardening. When asked about the household items made from human remains, Ed explained that he needed those things because the house felt empty after Mother died. He said he was just trying to make it feel more like home. When questioned about his murders, Ed showed no apparent guilt or remorse. He explained matter-of-factly that the bodies from the cemetery weren't very good anymore. They were too old, too decayed. He needed fresher material if he wanted to do good work. Dr. Edward Kelly, the psychiatrist who evaluated Ed, found a mind so profoundly damaged that it challenged basic assumptions about criminal responsibility. Dr. Kelly testified that Ed had never developed a normal moral compass. His actions were guided entirely by psychological needs rather by consideration of their effects on others. He literally could not understand why society considered his behavior wrong. In January 1958, Judge Robert Golmar ruled that Ed was not competent to stand trial due to mental illness. He was committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he would spend the next 27 years. Ed's case had already begun to influence popular culture. Robert Bloch, who lived in Wisconsin when the story broke, used Ed as inspiration for his novel Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film adaptation would introduce the world to Norman Bates. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Silence of the Lambs, countless other horror films all drew inspiration from the quiet farmer who had shocked the world with his unthinkable crimes. But the fictional versions gradually diverged from reality. The real Ed wasn't a cunning, articulate killer. He was a damaged, childlike individual whose crimes stemmed from profound psychological disturbance. In 1968, Ed was finally deemed competent to stand trial. Rather than face a full trial, he pled guilty to first-degree murder in Bernice Worden's death and received a life sentence. He remained at Central State Hospital until his death. On July the 26th, 1984, Ed Gein died quietly of lung cancer at the age of 77. There was no drama, no final confession, no last words, just an old man dying in a hospital. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent his grave from becoming a site of morbid pilgrimage. Today in Plainfield, Wisconsin, looks like any other small farming community. The hardware store where Bernice Worden was murdered now houses an antique shop. The Gein farmhouse burned down in 1994 in what many suspected was an arson fire. The boy, who was too frightened to play with other children, became the man whose crimes would terrify the world. The son, who could never escape his mother's control, became the inspiration for countless monsters.
Did you work all night at that time? No. How'd you think you'd happen? That's right. What would you do with the sexual parts? Stuff in. One was painted, they said. And that one, when they died, I think a potato. Is there anything like, How did this start, son? Let that stay much 4 years. So there's a bunch of photographers from the newspaper who want to take a picture. You want to take a picture? So what's not here? So we got 50 straight off. Would you enjoy it while you were doing it? Most of us tired, but I mean, they didn't care. I moved better, like, restless. When you take the grades up, you were kind of in the head too, is that it? That director just I'm guilty. And then one time you said you sort of realized what you were doing and you covered it up without taking the thing. That's right. What would you do with the sexual parts then? They them in the box, and then how would you, what would you do with the head? That must have been taken from reading about magazines and everything. Take them the flesh off like that head out there.
The son, who could never escape his mother's control, became the inspiration for countless fictional monsters. In death, as it is in life, Ed Gein remains trapped in the psychological prison that circumstances created, forever remembered for the worst things he ever did, rather than a cautionary tale about what can happen when severe mental illness goes untreated. Behind every sensationalized crime story are victims, real victims, whose lives were cut short. Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden deserve better than to become footnotes in a horror story. Their families deserve better than to have their tragedies turned into entertainment. That's the story of Ed Gein, the man who turned a quiet Wisconsin farmhouse into one of the darkest crime scenes in American history. His crimes shook a community, terrified a nation, and left a stain on our culture that horror films still draw from today. Thanks for joining me today, and be sure to tune in again for another episode on Murder and Coffee. I'm your host, Matt Cochran. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to share it. It really helps us keep telling these kind of stories. Be sure to leave a comment. And if you want to go even deeper into the chilling world of Ed Gein, you can pick up my book, Mother's Boy, on Amazon. The link is waiting for you right here in the description. Until next time, I'm your host, Matt Cochran. Stay safe out there, stay curious, and I'll see you on the next episode. This is Murder and Coffee.